Roberto watched the city through the bus window. The congested traffic and the city lights passed quickly before him, but his mind was elsewhere. He felt as though something was missing in his life. The repetitive work, the same daily routine, and the indifferent faces surrounding him made him feel like time was passing too quickly, and he didn't know how to change it. That afternoon, after another exhausting day, he found himself making an impulsive decision. He needed something new, something to break the monotony. That's how he ended up entering a small antique shop on a quiet, out-of-the-way street. The place, with its worn-down facade and the smell of old furniture, gave the impression that time itself passed more slowly there. Inside the shop, he found himself surrounded by objects that seemed to hold secrets of the past. Most were covered in dust, others more carefully tended to, as if they had been left there waiting for someone who would appreciate them. Roberto wandered among the shelves, lightly touching the items and reading the price tags. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking for, but something told him that somehow he needed to find something. That's when his eyes landed on a wall clock. It was different from any other he had ever seen. Old, with a slightly faded dial, and the numbers worn down. There was something about the shape of the hands and the way the clock seemed too old for such a common object. Something caught his attention, as if the object had been waiting for him. The seller, an elderly man with a faint smile, appeared beside him. "This clock has an interesting story," he said, his voice low and enigmatic. "It's not just an ordinary clock. It has something special." Roberto smiled, thinking the man was just trying to sell a product, but he couldn't help feeling drawn to it. "How much is it?" he asked, not expecting it to be cheap. "It's priced reasonably. It's waiting for someone who knows what to do with it," the seller replied, his gaze mysterious. Roberto hesitated for a moment, but something inside him told him to buy the clock. "I'll take it," he said, not thinking much about it. He paid and left the shop with the object in his hands, feeling both uneasy and intrigued. When he got home, he hung the clock on the wall in the living room, near the window. He sat on the couch and stared at the object. The sound of the ticking filled the room in a way he hadn't expected. At first, he tried to ignore it, but as time passed, he felt something strange. The clock seemed to be more than just a timepiece. It felt like a constant presence, as if it were watching him. As time went on, Roberto noticed something even more unsettling. Every time he looked at the clock, the hour hand seemed to move faster. He tried to ignore the feeling but couldn't. The time around him seemed distorted, as if the clock was altering his perception. Before going to bed, Roberto looked at the clock one more time. The hands were ahead of where they should be, and the ticking sounded louder. He tried to shake off the thought, but he knew something was happening. The clock was different from the others. Something was about to change, and he didn't know what it would be. In the days that followed, Roberto could no longer ignore what was happening. The clock he had bought, initially just an antique curiosity, had now become an obsession. His mind was restless, and time seemed to be more and more elastic. Sometimes, he felt as if the day was dragging on, and other times as though time was slipping away from him uncontrollably. His work, which he had once found monotonous and repetitive, now seemed like torture. Every time he looked at the clock on the wall of his office, he felt his anxiety growing. The ticking of the office clock seemed to drag on like an eternity, while the clock at home in his mind accelerated even faster, almost becoming a torment. When he came home, he felt a shiver at the sight of the clock in the living room. Every time his eyes fixed on it, he felt the pressure increase, as if he were being forced to look at something he could not fully understand. The clock was no longer just a timepiece. Now it had a life of its own. Roberto tried to ignore it, even trying to move the clock to a different place on the wall, but the ticking still followed him, echoing in his mind, even when he moved away. One evening, tired of trying to escape the clock, Roberto sat on his sofa and stared directly at the object. The hour hand moved almost imperceptibly, but he noticed a difference. He looked at the clock on the wall and then at his phone's clock. Time was distorting. He was sure of it. "It can't be," he murmured to himself. "I'm imagining things, but he wasn't. He could clearly see the hour hand on the clock moving faster than normal. He stood up abruptly, his heart pounding. He approached the clock, but as soon as he tried to adjust it, the hour hand moved even more, as if mocking his attempt to control time. At first, Roberto tried to rationalize the situation. It's just an illusion, he thought. I'm tired, stressed. Work, commitments. This is making me paranoid. But as the days went by, the sensation that time was speeding up only intensified. As the clock moved faster, Roberto also noticed that he was beginning to lose moments. He would wake up and feel as though he had already lost hours of his life, hours he couldn't understand where they had gone. At work, he noticed that often when he looked at the clock and then back at his computer, he had lost minutes, or sometimes more time. I was just checking an email. How could 30 minutes have passed, he thought, his anxiety growing. This phenomenon made him question whether he was living in a distorted reality, if the clock was really manipulated, or if his own perception of time was being altered. One afternoon, after yet another agonizing morning at work, Roberto decided to do something to understand better what was happening to him. When he went out for lunch, he went to a bookstore, searching for any book that could help him comprehend the phenomenon he was experiencing. For hours, he flipped through books on quantum physics, philosophy about time, and theories of relativity, but nothing seemed to apply to his experience. When he finally returned home, exhausted, he lay down on the sofa and looked at the clock once again. The ticking was now not just a sound. It was a dominating presence, a constant in his mind, filling all the silent spaces of his consciousness. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on something else, but the sound was in his head. Even with his eyes closed, he could hear the ticking. The clock was doing something to him. He felt that time was no longer something he controlled, but something that controlled him. He got up and went to the clock. His fingers touched the cold wood of the wall, and suddenly, the clock stopped. If you're enjoying this terrifying story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you won't miss the next chapters. Don't let time slip away. Subscribe now. It was as though time had interrupted itself, but in a strange way. Not with an absolute silence, but with a vacuum, an absence of movement. He stood there, frozen, staring at the clock face. And then, as if the clock had sensed his presence, it started again. But now, it was more intense, faster, more unbearable. Roberto didn't know what to do. He was trapped in something he couldn't understand, something beyond his control. All he knew was that he needed to get out of that house, out of that room. He didn't know where to go, but he knew he could no longer endure the pressure of time in his mind. The ticking continued, like a distant echo, but constant, and he knew that something much greater than him was happening. In the following days, Roberto could no longer ignore what was happening. The clock continued to accelerate time, but now he felt more and more powerless to stop it. Every time he looked at the dial, the hour hand seemed to move in a nearly supernatural way, advancing quickly as if defying reality. He tried adjusting the time, but every time he touched the hands, the clock seemed to reset itself immediately, as if it had a life of its own. Roberto felt like he was watching something that shouldn't be there, something he couldn't control. The constant ticking filled the room, echoing in his mind in an almost unbearable way. One night, after another day that seemed to last only a few hours, he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a hammer he found in the cupboard and with rage struck the clock, trying to destroy it. The wood cracked upon impact, but to his surprise, the clock didn't break. It stayed intact with its hands still turning relentlessly. "It's not possible," Roberto whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The clock seemed to mock his efforts. He tried in every way to manipulate the hands, to stop them or turn them back, but with each attempt the clock adjusted itself. And as he tried, the feeling that time was distorting grew. The clock wasn't just advancing the hours, it was taking control of his perception. He stepped away from the object, feeling defeated and lost. The clock no longer worked as a simple tool to measure time. It now seemed like an imposing being, with power over time itself, as if it were forcing Roberto to live in a cycle of compressed, accelerated hours that he couldn't control. Every night. He tried to sleep, but the sound of the ticking invaded his thoughts. He couldn't escape. Something inside him knew that the clock wasn't just an object. He was trapped, and now he knew he couldn't escape his fate. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. When he looked at the clock, the hands had advanced even further. Time wasn't just speeding up, it seemed to have completely distorted. Roberto no longer knew what to do. Destroying the clock didn't seem to be an option. He was trapped, as if the clock had imprisoned him within his own perception of time. The days passed, and Roberto's situation seemed increasingly unsustainable. The sensation of being consumed by the clock grew stronger with each passing moment. He was beginning to realize that the clock was no longer just an object, but something far deeper and incomprehensible. The pressure of time was like an invisible force bearing down on him. Work, already exhausting by nature, now felt like a torment. There was no longer any way to escape the feeling that time was spiraling out of control. He could no longer focus on the daily tasks. His concentration was fragmented, and his interactions with colleagues, which had once been trivial and superficial, now felt distorted, as though he were living in a version of reality where time didn't follow the same rules as before. Every time Roberto looked at the clock in the office, he felt a tightness in his chest. The ticking, which had once been just a background sound, now became louder in his mind, filling every silent space in his consciousness. He tried to focus, but his brain seemed to no longer function the same way. Time was no longer linear. It was as if he were being pushed forward without being able to control his steps. The afternoon that should have been calm dragged on, and Roberto knew something was wrong. He looked at the clock and felt his breath quicken. The sensation that time was compressing, that he was living in a cycle outside of his control, began to dominate his mind. At the end of the workday, Roberto could no longer stand it. He needed to leave. Without thinking, he stood up and hurried out of the office, unconcerned with the things he had left behind. He simply couldn't endure the idea of being trapped in that cycle any longer. He felt as though the clock had become a prison, a force that was pushing him toward a destiny he didn't understand. He went straight home, where the sensation of pressure grew stronger with every step. When he entered the living room, the sight of the clock made him stop for a moment. The ticking was louder than ever, more intense, more unbearable. The clock seemed to be manipulating his time, his mind, his body. He was losing his sanity. He sat on the sofa and closed his eyes, trying to concentrate on his breathing, trying to push away the thoughts that were consuming him. But when he opened his eyes, the pressure was still there, stronger than ever, as if he were being crushed by something he couldn't understand. The clock seemed to be pushing him to the edge of an abyss. That night, Roberto had a nightmare. He woke up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, his heart racing. He looked at the clock and saw that the hands had moved forward once, again. He knew he was no longer in control. The clock was controlling him, and he didn't know how to escape it. The feeling of being consumed by something so small and common was overwhelming. The clock was no longer just measuring time. It was manipulating him. The control, the calm, everything he had once believed in was slipping away. If this story is making you as tense as it's making us, don't forget to leave a like. It helps us keep bringing you more content like this. He got out of bed, determined to confront the clock once and for all. But as soon as he approached, the ticking intensified. It was as if time itself was mocking him. He no longer knew what to do. It was a losing battle. And Roberto was just beginning to realize that the clock would not let him escape so easily. Roberto left the shop not knowing exactly what to do with the revelation from the cellar. The idea of being trapped by an object that manipulated his perception of time seemed impossible to believe. But with every passing second, he felt the truth behind those words becoming more and more real. The clock, with its relentless ticking and uncontrollable hands, had become his prison. And now he knew there was no way to escape. That night, Roberto tried again to destroy the clock. He grabbed it with force, taking it to the window, trying to smash it against the floor. But to his surprise, the object remained intact, as if it had been made to resist any attempt to escape. He stepped back, exhausted and powerless, as the ticking seemed to intensify, filling every space in his mind. The clock now was no longer just an object. It was an entity, something he couldn't control. The days passed, and Roberto began to realize that his reality was falling apart. Time, once linear and predictable, was now fragmented. Some hours seemed to last only minutes, while others dragged on as if the day would never end. He could no longer tell when he was awake or sleeping, and every time he looked at the clock, a sense of dread took over him. He tried to escape his house, to get away from the clock's reach, but whenever he moved away, he felt time running, faster. The clock followed him like a shadow that would never leave. It was as if time had become an unrelenting force, something that pursued him without rest. He no longer knew how to react. There was nowhere left to run. On one especially disturbing night, Roberto was awakened by a feeling of absolute emptiness. The ticking of the clock was absent, but he knew that deep down, the object was there, somewhere, watching him. He got up and walked to the living room where the clock was still hanging on the wall, its hands frozen at a specific moment. It was stopped. But somehow, Roberto felt that time hadn't really stopped. It was simply waiting. Then, he understood. The clock wasn't just a tool to measure time. It had trapped him. It had turned Roberto into part of its own mechanism. Every time he looked at the clock, he wasn't just watching time pass. He was being consumed by it. The clock wasn't a tool to measure time. It was time itself. It was Roberto's prison, and now Roberto was a piece of that prison, incapable of escaping. Roberto stood there in front of the clock, feeling the weight of what he had just discovered. The words of the seller echoed in his mind, but he could no longer remember who he had been before all of this. Time had ceased to be something simple, a sequence of moments that he could control. Now he was part of something much larger, something that consumed him. The clock wasn't just an object, it was a force, an entity that controlled the very flow of time. The clock kept turning, its hands advancing with increasing speed. Roberto desperately tried to do something to stop it, but with every move he made, the feeling of powerlessness grew. He tried to step away, but the clock called to him, like an invisible force pulling him back. He couldn't escape, he couldn't run. The clock was his prison. He didn't know how long he had been there, trying and failing. Time seemed to stretch, and he could no longer tell whether it was day or night. The hours transformed into a mist, a succession of moments that overlapped, becoming one single endless now. Every second that passed blended into the next, until Roberto no longer knew if he was alive or dead, awake or dreaming. He was trapped in a reality that made no sense. And then, suddenly, the clock stopped. The sound of the ticking ceased. The hour hand and the minute hand froze as if time itself had been suspended. Silence spread through the house, heavy and uncomfortable. Roberto stood there staring at the clock, waiting for it to start moving again. But it didn't. Nothing happened. What do you think will happen to Roberto? Leave your comment below and share your theories. We love hearing what you think. That's when the truth was revealed. The clock wasn't just marking time. It had trapped him. It had turned Roberto into part of its own mechanism. Every moment, he looked at the clock. He wasn't just watching time pass, he was being consumed by it. The clock wasn't a tool to measure time. It was time itself. It was Roberto's prison, and now Roberto was a piece inside that prison, unable to escape. The moment the clock stopped, Roberto knew that there was no going back. He couldn't destroy the clock. He couldn't run. Time, which once seemed something to be controlled, now controlled him. And he, along with the clock, was eternal. No beginning, no end. Just the eternal ticking, and he was trapped within it. And so, Roberto disappeared. Not dead, but not alive. Just another part of the clock. Trapped in time, condemned to turn forever like the gears of fate.